I'd like to start with a quote. Now, with this bill, the voice of justice speaks again. Housing law don't normally receive such a fulsome praise, but when President Lyndon Johnson signed the Fair Housing Act into law in April 1968, he felt the legislation and its impact deserved in that claim of proclaim the fair housing for all. All human beings who live in this country is now part of the American way of life, Johnson said. Why is the act necessary? The Fair Housing Act is often portrayed as complementary to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 as it aimed to address entrenched housing segregation. Practices such as redlining and restrictive covenant denying protected class access to insurance or home loans fostered segregation in many areas. What does the act do? In short, the act is meant to create a unitary housing market where only your financial resources, not your background, can prevent you from renting or purchasing a home. The act bans any refusal to rent or sell a dwelling based on race, color, religion, sex, familial status, national origin, or disability, in addition to set the design guidelines and accessibility requirements applied to certain type of housing. In addition, it bans any discrimination in form of applying different terms or conditions for the sale or rental of the property based on those characteristics. As well, any advertising that expresses preference for those characteristics. Finally, treats threats, coercion, intimidation, or interference with someone's right to enjoy the freedom to rent or buy property is also prohibited. How does it work? The Department of Housing and Urban Development is charged with the enforcing of Fair Housing Act. HUD office's Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity FHEO receives the complaint. How is it passed? The act was finally passed in 1968 after the protracted push by civil rights leaders. Martin Luther King Jr. and others had begun to make segregated housing a cornerstone to protest and take action. King famously journeyed to Chicago to fight for fair housing and was struck in the head by a stone during that march. In addition, groups such as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, NGI Forum, and the National Committee Against Discrimination in Housing lobbied for legislation in part because African American and Hispanic soldiers returning from Vietnam War were having difficulties renting in certain neighborhoods. During the Senate consideration of the bill, Senator Edward Brooke of Massachusetts spoke about difficulty as an African American renting a home after returning from his service overseas at the World War II. The federal legislation was signed into law by President Lyndon Johnson a week after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. It was considered the final major legislative act of the civil rights era. Did it work? While the Fair Housing Act made housing discrimination illegal and practices, in reality, a significant degree of segregation still exists across much of the country. According to 2012 study by the American Constitution Society, fair housing in the United States remains a pressing civil rights issue. Despite the passage of the law, a generation of the politicians from both parties have failed to fully enforce the law as documented in a lengthy ProPublica series. There are also significant social and economic costs to continued segregation. A recent study showed that Chicago segregation costs residents $4.4 billion every year in a potential earnings. What is the future? Secretary Carson, whose previous comments suggest a tough love approach to housing laws and enforcement, has spoken out against the AFFH rule, Affirmative Further Fair Housing, which says that cities and community receiving HUD funds needs to create a plan that addresses segregation and inequality. The Trump administration's proposed cuts would not impact the FHEO, and I hope Joanne can tell us how does the FHEO office sustains and what's the future of FHEO office. Thank you, Joanne, please.
I'm pleased to be here today. It's a tough act to follow the previous speakers, but I'll give it my all. This month marks the 51st anniversary of the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968. Each spring, when the nation observes Fair Housing Month, we renew our commitment to the principles of justice and equality which flow through our civil rights laws. The Fair Housing Act is not just text dependent to the United States Code. Indeed, it assures the constitutionally mandated guaranteed rights of equal protection under the law are reflected in our housing laws. The Act, when originally passed, included race, color, national origin, and religion. In 1974, sex was added, and in 1988, families with children and disability were added as protected classes. The Act hasn't been amended since. America has experienced tremendous progress since the Fair Housing Act was enacted. But when housing options are limited, it makes it more difficult for individuals and families to access good schools, jobs, and economic opportunity they need to get ahead. The lack of an adequate supply of decent and safe, affordable housing is limiting the housing options of many low-income families. More and more municipalities are struggling to meet the housing needs of their constituents while juggling competing priorities. At the same time, discrimination continues to prevent some from accessing the housing of their choice. Last year alone, HUD and its state and local partner agencies received almost 8,000 complaints alleging some form of discrimination. What's more, anecdotal evidence suggests that a lot of complaints of discrimination actually go unreported. HUD's Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity, which is where I'm from, is working hard to combat unlawful housing discrimination. Through an array of enforcement activities, policy initiatives, and education outreach efforts, FHO is taking appropriate action against individual owners and housing providers that violate the law. In particular, the department has continued its efforts to address discriminatory practices that deny housing based on race or national origin, combating lending discrimination, protecting the rights of persons with disabilities, and advancing the program that increases job opportunities for low-income individuals and contracting opportunities for the business that hire them. We call that Section 3. Last year, HUD awarded $23 million in fair housing enforcement and education to fair housing organizations. And last week, HUD announced that it had awarded an additional an additional $15 million. Over $1 million of those funds are going to organizations in the state of New York, including Chautauqua Opportunities, CNY Fair Housing, and Housing Opportunities Made Equal. Those are the upstate organizations. There's obviously additional ones downstate. And while any form of discrimination stains the very fabric of our nation, HUD is especially focused on protecting the rights of individuals to feel safe and secure in their homes, free from sexual harassment or unwanted sexual advances. That's why the theme for this month's Fair Housing is called Call HUD, it's on the chart, Call HUD because sexual harassment in housing is illegal. And that's, the theme is a call to action. It's an appeal to those who experience discrimination, particularly survivors of sexual harassment, to contact HUD for help. HUD and the Department of Justice have launched a nationwide initiative intended to increase awareness and reporting of sexual harassment in housing. The initiative includes the establishment of an interagency task force between the two agencies, an outreach toolkit, and a public awareness campaign that makes it easier for victims all around the country to find resources and report harassment. The campaign's 60-second public service announcement features 3 victims of sexual harassment who challenged their mistreatment by following complaints with HUD. I'm going to tell you about some of the cases in just a minute. And in the months to come, HUD will host a series of training sessions for Public Housing Authority employees, board members, and residents on what constitutes sexual harassment and what should be done to address it. We recently settled a case in Chautauqua involving an allegation of sexual harassment. There, the maintenance man had been sexually harassing a tenant in a senior complex. The allegation was that the maintenance worker made inappropriate comments, lurked around her apartment, and had been surreptitiously in her apartment. The settlement calls for the maintenance person to work elsewhere. He has a new job now. The locks in her apartment were changed. He had to write a letter of apology to the complainant. She received $500 off her rent for the next couple of months, and she got a lump sum payment of $2,000. Plus, of course, they had to develop a sexual harassment policy, and HUD provided training to the landlord staff. We include training often as a way to prevent future complaints. In the New York office, we are investigating a few other sexual harassment complaints. Unfortunately, I can't tell you about them because we're still investigating them. But outside of New York State, there have been several sexual harassment cases that have been settled. And to mention just a few, the Kansas City Housing Authority paid $360,000 in damages to 14 current and former female housing authority residents, settling allegations that the housing authority employees subjected residents and prospective tenants to sexual harassment. The settlement also required the housing authority to obtain fair housing training for its staff, adopt new policies and procedures to prevent the employees from future inappropriate conduct, and establish a method through which residents can file complaints with the housing authority. HUD approved a settlement owner between the owners of a Reno, Nevada apartment building and its property manager and a female resident. They resolved it. She'd been sexually harassed. They resolved it with the payment of $7,000 to the resident, as well as attending fair housing training, modifying their lease agreement to say that that they don't engage in discriminatory practices. I guess that's to put everybody on notice. In April 2018, HUD reached settlements with landlords in Florida, Virginia, and California, involving allegations of sexual harassment for a total of $125,000 in relief for the victims. And HUD approved a $100,000 settlement in Florida between the local public housing authority and a female resident, resolving allegations that one of the housing authority's maintenance workers sexually harassed her. HUD also charged the owner of a mobile home park in Tennessee with discrimination for allegedly pressuring 2 female tenants to perform sexual favors for him instead of paying rent. No one should have to endure harassment or mistreatment in order to keep a roof over their head. Another form of discrimination that HUD is particularly active in addressing is discrimination against families with children. Since 1988, the Fair Housing Act has prohibited housing discrimination against families with children under the age of 18. This includes refusing to rent to a family that includes 1 or more children, imposing additional fees, or establishing different rules for families with children. And also covered our expectant families, whether it's a pregnant woman or someone who's in the process of securing custody or adopting a child. Housing is what enables families to feel grounded, to have a sense of security and consistency. Yet every year, HUD receives 800 complaints alleging this form of discrimination. It actually accounts for about 10% of our entire complaint caseload. In a recent case out of New Jersey, the department brought a charge against a landlord for discriminating against a prospective African-American tenant and her daughter by refusing to negotiate for rent, making discriminatory statements, falsely representing the availability of a unit, and intimidating and then threatening based on race. The landlord used both racially charged language verbally and in text messages. And this case is currently being litigated. Last fall, HUD charged a New Orleans landlord with housing discrimination for advertising units in a way that discriminates against families. One specific ad that the landlord placed said, "No teenagers, please," which is not legal. It's illegal to advertise no children, adults only, couples only, suitable for 2 adults. We've seen all of these. A lot of them show up on Craigslist, and these type of advertisements happen all too often, and they're not legal. In the New York office, we are currently investigating several such advertisement-type cases. Last summer, HUD charged the owner and manager of rental homes in Alabama with discrimination for refusing to rent a 3-bedroom house to a woman because she had 3 young children. The case was settled with the owner agreeing to pay the woman $10,500. Last summer, HUD also charged the owners of a rental home in Minnesota with discrimination for refusing to rent a 6-bedroom house to a blended family because they are Native American and Hispanic. Last month, the owners paid $74,000 as part of a HUD consent order settling the case. HUD is also devoting a lot of energy to fighting the discrimination many persons with disabilities all too often face. Disabilities count for nearly 60% of HUD's work nationwide, and in the New York office, because I checked before I came here, it's about 71%. The department has handled several disability discrimination cases that involve veterans, individuals who have risked their lives to protect our freedom, being denied the use of service or emotional support animals. In New York City, a charge of discrimination was issued in February 2019 in a case involving a veteran and a 9/11 first responder. After the tenant requested an emotional support animal, the landlord refused the request, then tried to evict him, and then retaliated by charging really excessive fees that kept showing up on his rental bill every month. The case is currently being litigated, since it only happened in February. In another case, also in New York, the department settled a case involving a veteran with a service dog. The co-op attempted to evict the owner after he requested to be able to keep a trained service dog. This case was settled with the veteran being able to retain the dog, and he received $25,000 from the co-op. And of course, the co-op was also required to receive training by HUD. There have also been other cases in other parts of the country as well, or even this one's on Long Island. On Long Island, a resident shareholder was denied the opportunity to obtain an emotional support animal due to the no-pet policy that the co-op maintained. This case was settled. The complainant received $25,000. As well, the board was provided with training and created a reasonable accommodation policy. In Queens, New York, just last month, we settled a case involving an assistance animal for a mother and her hearing-impaired daughter. When they asked for the assistance animal, the co-op tried to evict them and charge them legal fees of $12,788. The settlement waived the legal fees and gave them a lump sum of $7,000. And of course, they were permitted to keep the dog, and we provided training to the co-op board. We settled a case in Glens Falls where the landlord had assigned certain apartments on the first floor in one building where residents who needed animals could live. The settlement in that case permits residents with disabilities who need a dog to live anywhere on the premises. And there was also monetary relief, but what the complainant really wanted was the policy change, which we got. And because the department is aware that many housing providers continue to have questions regarding their responsibilities when it comes to emotional support and assistance animals, the department is developing guidance that will be issued. Hopefully that'll provide a little bit greater clarity to landlords and housing providers. At the same time, HUD is doing more to ensure that low-income individuals have an opportunity to move towards self-sufficiency and achieve economic upward mobility. This includes putting renewed energy into Section 3 of the Housing and Urban Development Act. This program seeks to increase access to jobs for low and very low-income individuals. In the last year, expenditures of HUD-covered funding generated more than 29,000 jobs, almost 12,000 of which were Section 3 hires. Also, of the more than $5 billion in construction contracts that were awarded during last year, almost $500 million in contracts were awarded to over 2,500 Section 3 businesses. So, in conclusion, I'd just like to say that more than 50 years after the Fair Housing Act was enacted, HUD remains firmly committed to creating a nation where every person has the same access to housing and economic opportunity. And I'd like to thank you for allowing me to participate in this year's Fair Housing Month celebration. It's been my pleasure.